He laughed. Not a quiet, embarrassed chuckle, an outright laugh that filled the kitchen like it owned the room. It was the kind of laugh people use when they think someone's being dramatic for attention. Derek leaned back on the counter, beer in hand, and laughed at the cardboard box on the floor with my life in it. His mother, Janet, nodded as if this were the punchline to a family joke she'd been waiting to hear. I stood there with the box open, clothes folded inside, a resignation letter tucked into the top like a folded napkin. The HR woman had said the same word she always says: "We wish you the best." Margaret Chin had been precise, so clinical you almost believed she meant it. Margaret had arranged the meeting, typed the letter, handed me the box. She had also looked at me with a tiny private nod, something we'd both agreed, silently and carefully, in the weeks before. "Can't believe you're actually taking that," Derek said between laughs. "You were always so proud of fixing spreadsheets in your pajamas." He tapped his phone as if it were a scoreboard, and the number of likes would prove this small domestic humiliation. Janet offered a suggestion about my cooking. "If you want, I can show you how to make a roast that doesn't dry out," she said with a smile that landed like a hand on my shoulder. I folded my jacket into the cardboard and felt a kind of surgical calm. The laugh did what it was supposed to do. It made me look small. There's a particular clarity that comes the moment you decide to stop performing the role someone else expects of you. It's cold and steady and shockingly practical. Standing there with my box, watching Derek laugh, I felt my plan click into place like the last piece of a puzzle. This wasn't the end of my career. It was the shield. If you like real justice stories, hit like now. People imagine a whistleblower as someone who storms out in a blaze of righteous glory, mic'd up and loud. That's not how it happened. I staged a layoff, not to deceive the people who mattered most, no, to protect them, but to create a plausible exit that would keep the evidence safe and allow an agency to investigate without tipping off a room full of executives with full access to my account privileges. For 6 months, I had been collecting pieces, files, emails, signed manifests, that didn't add up. The first real sign came from a pension statement a friend slid across my desk one rainy Tuesday. Carol Simmons, an office assistant who had been at Meridian Financial for 23 years, had received a near-empty statement. Her monthly payout had vanished into a blank line. She was terrified and confused. She brought the paper to me because I was a senior accountant who'd done audits for years. It should have been a simple clerical error. Instead, it was a doorway.
What I found behind that door was mechanical and monstrous in its own way. Phantom transactions, shifted balances, shell entities, and a smooth choreography of paperwork that made money disappear, while the company's public statements insisted everything was fine. The theft wasn't a dramatic smash and grab. It was rows of numbers and signatures and dates moved by people who knew how to make a ledger tell the story they wanted. I call them phantom shipments. On paper, a truck left Henderson Logistics lot every Tuesday with crates bound for a warehouse in New Jersey. The manifests were signed, the invoices were processed, the payment run showed money moving. The problem was the GPS logs didn't match. The receiving warehouse never registered the load, and trucks' maintenance records showed the vehicles were idle. Someone had learned how to mirror the appearance of legitimate logistics, paper trails, approval stamps, digital timestamps, without moving a single pallet. Henderson showed up in the mess because Meridian had outsourced a lot of its shipping. Names I trusted were on the paperwork. Derek's signature appears on a handful of those manifests. I don't want to say my husband forged these. I can't reach into his mind and pull out intent. What I can say is that his name, his signature, and the route numbers I pulled from Meridian's internal logs matched documents flagged in the scheme. When I looked closer, I found a pattern that implicated his employer in a way that would connect the missing funds to real-world channels. I began at night, one file at a time. I worked from the office after hours, then at home on my laptop when the house had settled and Derek had turned the game on and Janet had started her crossword. I learned to read systems the way some people learn to read people, by watching what they repeated and where they left crumbs. I copied emails into encrypted drives. I took photos of ledgers with my phone. I saved metadata and printed screenshots. When a CFO emailed a subordinate and wrote, "Remember to adjust quarters," next to a line item, I flagged it. When an accountant archived a spreadsheet with a note that looked like a password hint, I saved that too. There is a paradox about paperwork.
It is at once utterly mundane and incredibly revealing. A stamped date can blow a story wide open. A missed approval can tell you who's happy to look away. I learned to parse euphemisms, adjustment, reclassification, special handling, into real meaning. Special handling turned out to mean moving pension contributions into an offshore fund under a shell company's name. Reclassification turned out to mean wiping a liability from the books and pretending pension money had been invested elsewhere. I should say here that none of this felt heroic in the moment. It felt lonely, it felt necessary, it felt precise. The first time I mentioned anything to anyone outside my circle, it was to a woman named Michelle Torres. She was an FBI special agent with steady eyes and a voice that did not try to soothe. She listened without surprise, which made me feel both calmer and more exposed. We met at a coffee shop that played quiet jazz, and given how often we met there, the barista eventually stopped asking our names. She taught me two things that mattered immediately, public this got. The agency would need time to build an airtight case. Too quick, and the people we planned to indict would disperse funds, destroy records, and muddy the trail. Too slow, and more pensions would be drained, and more employees would go without. So we made an exit strategy. Margaret Chin in HR owed me something. Maybe a debt, maybe a long-shared ethic, maybe the quiet recognition that sometimes corporate actors needed to do a small subversive thing for the right reason. She agreed to code my termination as a layoff. She would hand me the official letter. She would keep the meeting perfunctory and public enough that the company wouldn't suspect an internal leak. In exchange, the FBI got cover to extract files and run shadow audits without Meridian executives screaming obstruction or warning everyone. Margaret said, "We'll say it's part of restructuring." She fixed the clock and shook my hand. The cardboard box with my things became a prop. Derek saw humiliation. Margaret and I saw mobility. Michelle saw space to move. I walked out looking like somebody who had failed a role I had always thought I performed adequately. That put a target on the investigation rather than on me. At home, everyone slipped back into their routines. Derek joked about it at dinner. Janet critiqued my spice rack. The household never altered its routines in any visible way. I had chosen the most inconspicuous exit possible, so it made sense that no one believed there was anything deeper. That helped. Deception is easier when it resembles a blur of normal life. The hardest part was isolating the truth without harming the people who would be hurt by it. Carol Simmons was not a person I could sacrifice for a moral arc. She was the grieving center of the story I'd found. When I told Michelle about Carol, the agent's voice made a soft, deliberate pause. "We need her statements," Michelle said. "We need as many affected employees as we can get, without scaring them into withdrawing before we can get subpoenas." So I sat with Carol in her small apartment, and we went over every bank record she had. She cried once when she realized the number she'd expected each month was gone. I made coffee and printed ledgers. I showed her what I'd found in the company books. She wasn't interested in my career or my quiet competence. She just wanted to know if her rent check would go through next month. That detail focused me more than anything else. I don't want to dramatize suffering. The victim's pain is concrete and domestic. That's why I kept returning to domestic images while the legal machine spun. A pension statement, a woman's apartment, a child's school supply list, a dinner plate gone cold because the person who had eaten there that night had tears in their eyes. There were nights I came home and folded a dish towel with the methodical calm of someone aligning evidence in a folder. The sound of the kitchen faucet on these nights was an anchor. Derek would be on the couch, half watching a game, and say something that would make the hairs on my arms lift, and aside about how accounting was boring, or how some people just like to make mountains out of molehills. I would fold the towel and the world would simplify itself. The towel was an object with edges, corners, and a clear purpose. Evidence, too, needed edges and corners. We built a physical and digital library. Some files were printed and hidden in a lockbox. Others were encrypted and stored on drives I'd carried in a camera bag that no one questioned because it looked like a photographer's kit. I learned the small language of encryption, enough to protect what I had without trying to present myself as a security expert. When people ask how I kept myself safe, I say only that I kept the evidence dispersed, one copy in a safe deposit, one encrypted, one with an attorney who had agreed to hold it until a warrant could be issued. The FBI had ways to preserve chain of custody once they were ready. My job had been to collect, copy, and conceal. The more I collected, the more dangerous the picture became. Meridian's balance sheets were elegant in their deception. Money had been systematically diverted into accounts tied to shell companies that, on the surface, were doing consulting or investment management. The key players were nimble with language and numbers. When I found an internal memo that read, reclassify pensions into long-term holdings, it looked like accounting cheerleading to anyone outside. To anyone who knew what to look for, it was a blueprint for moving money away from beneficiaries. Some of those memos were signed by people in positions of authority. Some were passed in emails with forwards and replies that looked innocent. Some were smoothed over in meeting minutes that recorded executive discretion, as if that were a neutral phrase. The absence of a formal objection in a minute can be damning, because silence can be its own kind of consent. I collected names of affected people. I wrote them down in a notebook that was heavy with handwriting and coffee rings. Carol Simmons, Harold Evans, Liza Park. People with children, mortgages, small businesses, teeth that needed fixing. They were the reason I did not take any dramatic step that would trigger a premature cleanup. The bank accounts they depended on needed to be turned back on. The funds needed recovery.
That required method, patience, and an agency with the power to demand documents and seize assets. I should be frank. There were points when I hoped Derek would notice and stop laughing. Not because I wanted public validation, but because the easiest way out would have been to tell him everything, hand him the papers, and let him carry the moral burden with me. That would have been a mistake. The inquiry had to look like it came from outside. It had to be built into an institutional narrative, a federal investigation, not a domestic dispute. The agency needed to be able to subpoena files without the company claiming the allegation was a private vendetta. The FBI is not the stuff of movies. Michelle wore plain shoes and did not shout. She wrote things down in neat block letters. She cleared her throat and explained in the small, exact way agents do that there would be depositions, subpoenas, and a grand jury. Those words were heavy. I had heard them in passing in my work, witnesses, sworn testimony, but hearing them in the context of Meridian made them real and immediate. A deposition is a recorded interview where you answer questions under oath. It can be used later in court or to inform grand jury proceedings. A grand jury, Michelle explained, is not the same as a trial. It's the tool prosecutors use to decide whether the facts amount to criminal charges. It's like a gate. The gate can be slammed shut if the defense overwhelms the narrative early by attacking credibility. That's why we had to be careful. Witness preparation would be part of the process, and the FBI would arrange for measures to preserve evidence before moving into the open. There's an odd moral clarity in a plan that binds you to legal process. You can't run on emotion. You can't let hunger for swift retribution push you into disclosure that ruins a case. That was a lesson I learned by sitting in small, windowless rooms with Michelle and an agent named Patrick, who smelled faintly of coffee. They drew timelines on legal pads, and I supplied the names and the paper trail. We mapped out what evidence would be most crucial to demonstrate intent and knowledge, the ledger adjustments, the emails that explicitly referenced pension reallocations, and the chain of approvals. And so the 2-week timeline was born. 2 weeks, the window the FBI suggested before they would execute more public measures. It was a strategy that balanced urgency with the need to lock things down. The goal: preserve the evidence, bring in certain witnesses for testimony, and set the public exposure so minimal damage was done to the victim's recovery prospects. 2 weeks felt both forever and the blink before a thunderclap. In the days leading up to that window, the house felt like a stage set. I would make a dinner of stew and salad and place a napkin on the table with calm, deliberate movements. Derek would complain about the traffic at work. Janet would ask about leftover cake.
I would answer with short sentences and avoid the temptation to look at Derek's phone or his emails. I could not allow myself the false relief of knowledge. I had to preserve both the investigation and the impression of normalcy, because the one helped the other. Margaret's face haunted me on some nights. She had the kind of efficiency that made her an HR director for a reason. When she handed me the layoff letter, her voice was flat. "It's a corporate decision," she said. "We're streamlining." She folded her hands over mine as if we were conspirators by accident. You would think collusion of this sort would have shown her as dangerous or glamorous. It did not. Her kindness was small and decisive. She gave me cover. She also bore risk. Because of the way Meridian was structured, certain executives could bury evidence with a single memo that shuffled a ledger line or moved an account overseas. That possibility was always there, and part of our strategy involved timing.
If we could get subpoenas and warrants in place, the company wouldn't have the freedom to burn those bridges. The gears of federal power move slowly in some respects and quickly in others. The question was whether the agency would act in rhythm with the evidence I had gathered. The neighborhood continued its life. Children played in front yards, mail carriers waved, Derek's friends came by for a game night and ate chips on the coffee table. No one would have guessed the lunatic precision that had been set in motion just behind the curtains. People imagine drama as loud things. Most crimes are quiet. Most betrayals happen in the white space between meetings, in the margins of spreadsheets. I kept a mental inventory of things that mattered, a set of file paths on the server, a string of email addresses, the dates stamped on wire transfers, the time an invoice was created. These were the threads on which a prosecution might hang. But I also kept a list of names: Carol, Harold, Liza, because they were the people who needed restitution. Those names made the legal machinery feel like more than a procedural triumph. They made it feel humane, even if the system that had wronged them was vast and efficient at hiding its crime. There was one night when Derek came home early, only a little early, really. He had an errand, he said, or maybe he lied and just wanted to see what kind of stew I had made. He stepped into the house, hung up his jacket, and laughed at the box again as if to reinforce a point. I looked at him and said simply, "You're home early." He shrugged. Traffic cleared up. Lucky me. There was a minor exchange about the remote. His finger tapped the cushion of the couch as if the world were a game that could be paused. He had no idea what was moving like a second current under the surface of our lives. 2 weeks is not long in the life cycle of an investigation, but it is long enough for a lot to happen in a marriage.
I began to imagine all of the moments that could change a man's face from amusement to alarm. I rehearsed conversations in my head. I imagined what it would feel like for Derek to see a signature he recognized on a manifest tied to a phantom shipment. I imagined Janet's hands at work, knitting a sweater as the world changed outside her living room window. I imagined Carol opening a packet from her bank to find a notice that her payments were restored. I imagined a newsroom phone lighting up with the first public disclosure. I imagined, too, the tightness that comes when you realize your life is both the object and the instrument of a larger truth. I did the most ordinary things with an intensity that surprised me. I washed a dish and felt the warmth of the water as if it were a compass. I ironed a shirt and smoothed away the wrinkles with the same patience I used to smooth out a contentious ledger entry. I called Carol and sat on a bench outside a church where pigeons hopped for crumbs and made sure she had someone to pick her up if she needed to go to the bank. I met Michelle one evening in a fluorescent-lit government office and gave her a thumb drive with the updated file list. She looked at me and asked, without melodrama, whether I was ready. "Am I ready?" I said. "For what?" "For the truth being public," she answered. "For people asking why you didn't go to them sooner. For lawyers trying to paint you as unreliable." I suppose that was the strangest part of my preparation, the foreknowledge that truth has consequences that fall like pebbles in concentric circles. Some of those pebbles would hit perfectly innocent people. Some would ricochet in ways that made other people's reputations look like brittle glass. That knowledge requires a kind of ethical reflex. You sharpen the facts so the ripples are least damaging to the weak. There is also a peculiar, intimate cruelty in being underestimated by the person closest to you. Derek's laughter is the image people remember because it is simple and brutal. It told me what the world thought of the woman who could fix an audit and balance a family checkbook. He treated my work as an amusing hobby, not an ethical practice with consequences for hundreds of people. There are worse things than being laughed at. Being invisible is worse. That laugh was a kind of inattention that allowed me to move without being observed. The house in those last 2 weeks was both a theater and a trap. I moved like someone walking a wire, visible but inert. I filed receipts and made grocery lists. I let the laundry pile a bit higher so no one would notice I was sleeping with my laptop in a drawer. I learned not to watch Derek too closely for fear of betraying the game. For a long time, the hardest thing was to keep from telling him everything and asking him to care in the way I needed him to. We kept our old rituals. I drove the car to the mechanic. I called my mother-in-law about a dentist appointment. I made lists.
Normal life is the armor you need when you are doing something complicated in secret. Within the office, the tone remained as corporate as ever. The glass hallway, the artful plant arrangements, the coffee that tasted like a commitment to middle management. No one outside our small circle of knowledge suspected that folders labeled Q3 adjustments were actually gateways to indictments. People behave as if appearances are real. The truth sits behind those appearances like a person in a room with the lights off. As the 2-week window tightened, Michelle and I refined a plan for witnesses. She wanted to bring in employees who could corroborate the audit trails, who could say under oath that they saw ledger lines changed in ways that made no sense. We had to decide who would be strong witnesses and who would be vulnerable to character attacks. It was not a pleasant conversation. I named Carol first. Carol had been consistent. She had bank statements, a quiet dignity, and a willingness to testify. I worried about others who might be intimidated by a courtroom and the glare of press. One morning, Derek asked me casually if I had ever thought about staying home full-time. He said it like a bomb. "You could finally learn to cook that roast properly," he told me. Janet chuckled and chimed in with a recipe she loved. They were both smiling in the way people do when they think the conversation is entirely ordinary. I replied, the truth folded into a sentence. "I'm doing something that needs secrecy. It won't be long." They laughed. That laugh was not mean now. It was an embarrassed attempt at comfort. They had no idea. That made my throat ache. Inside the folder I kept in a place no one would think to look, behind a row of tax manuals on a shelf, were copies of the most damning documents. Some were spreadsheets with hidden columns revealed. Some were email threads that tracked the movement of funds. Some were the art of corporate euphemism in memo form. The more I pulled at those threads, the more the pattern emerged with that awful, ordinary clarity. People had made a decision to treat pension funds as a movable budget item. There were moments of fierce clarity that felt almost like joy, not at the prospect of someone being punished, but at the steadiness of having a path forward. I would sit at my dining table with a printed spreadsheet in front of me and feel like a surgeon holding a scalpel. The work was clinical. It required precision. It required that I not be distracted by small cruelties. Derek's laughter, for all its sting, was a small cruelty. 2 weeks became days. The FBI began to coordinate with prosecutors. They arranged for a discreet meeting that would, if everything went according to plan, force certain actors to face questions without giving them the chance to stifle the investigation. Michelle explained that sometimes bringing the right person into the right time could end the pretense.
It could be a moment when a signature was recognized. It could be a moment when someone realized that the paper they thought was harmless was actually the missing link to a network of fraud. The last night before the window closed, I sat alone in the house pretending to watch an old film. The credits rolled and I had not moved the remote. I looked at the cardboard box that still sat in the spare room with a sweater and a couple of notebooks. I opened the drawer in my desk and checked the drives one more time. The feeling was similar to waiting for a surgeon to come out and say the operation was successful. The waiting was full of noise, and the world outside went on with its tiny concerns. I made a list of contingencies. If Derek's name appeared on a document in front of him, what would happen? If he was asked to come in for a witness interview, would he cooperate? If Margaret's role became public, would she be forced to testify? Each scenario came with a human cost that I could not ignore. The lives we were upending were not simply corporate abstractions. They were the neighbors, the colleagues, the people who might have to rebuild. There was no turning back. That realization was not a cinematic tremor. It was more like a light switching on. The house felt like a hushed auditorium. The next morning, I set the table for a breakfast that looked ordinary. I placed 2 mugs on the counter. Derek came in, hair mussed, shirt untucked, and for a moment the world looked exactly as it always had. He kissed me on the cheek and said, without much feeling, "Good luck today." I smiled, because the truth is we can be generous in ways that do not reciprocate. I had been generous with truth for a long time, patient, careful, ethical. Sometimes generosity requires you to be the one who bears the cost of being underestimated. When the door clicked and Derek left for work, I sat at the table and breathed. I had gone through the motions of domestic life so often that rendering it now felt like a costume. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and considered the small domestic details that would for me always be sewn to this time in my life. The hum of the refrigerator, the scratch of a pen on a checklist, the smell of coffee in the kitchen that morning. Michelle arrived shortly after in clothes that were meant to be unremarkable. She set a small black case on the table and nodded at me. "Everything in place?" she asked. "All in place," I said. She opened the case and took out a stack of documents. Her expression did not change. Her hand didn't tremble. She had the look of someone who'd learned to hold bad news like an ordinary object. We went over the names one last time. Caroline, Harold, Liza, Timothy at accounts payable. The list was the map of the harm we were about to lay bare. We set the timing, 2 weeks. The agency would make moves to secure records and bring certain people in for questioning. There would be no storming in with sirens the next day.
There would be a calibrated sequence of steps that, if done in order, would limit the company's ability to destroy the trail. I felt the mechanics of power align like gears.
Then another call came. Meridian had agreed to a meeting with a condition. It wanted to send its CEO for a conversational home visit. They suggested a quiet, private talk to clarify certain documents before anything went public. The CEO's name, Richard Brennan, was a man who wore tailored suits and a practiced smile. The offer sounded like an attempt to soften the edges or to test a reaction. "Why would they come here?" I asked. "They're trying to see what we'll do," Michelle said. "It's not unusual. Powerful people sometimes try to head us off by offering cooperation or by trying to intimidate." I found myself arranging the table. Plates are unreliable allies. They could be used by people who wanted to eat uncomfortably in a quiet house while the world outside prepared to pivot. I moved a chair slightly to the left. I checked the locks. Small rituals, yes, but rituals are how you keep the practical world aligned with the decisions you've made. When Derek called mid-morning to say he'd be home early because of a maintenance issue at work, I felt the air change in a way that I could not make tidy. He said it cheerfully, like he'd just pressed the pause button on his day. I had been rehearsing answers for the man who would find his name on a piece of paper whose gravity I could not yet show him. I placed a bowl of fruit on the table to make the room look as ordinary as possible. I waited for the moment that would split the life we had from the life we were about to have. I did not know what Derek's face would become. I did not know what he would say. I only knew that he could no longer be a passive character in a scene I had created for safety's sake. At some point, the private, deliberate work of uncovering would intersect with the private life we had built together. The house was quiet in that peculiar way that precedes a storm. The blinds were slightly open. The sun made a path on the floor. Carol's number sat in my phone, and in my mind a small, steady image of her sitting at her kitchen table held me like an anchor. The document stack on the dining table was not massive, just enough to make a point. It was time to be both careful and unavoidable. I heard a car pull into the driveway. The door clicked. Footsteps approached. I stood up. The day had condensed into a single hinge. He opened the door, keys in hand, and I watched his face before I heard his laugh. For a second, he looked like any man coming home early, pleased to have extra time. Then he saw the box in the corner, then the case on the table, then Michelle's quiet, official stance. He saw the paper. He saw the name. "You're home early," I said. He smiled without the laugh. The smile held questions. The next breath was the one that would change everything.
He looked at the papers before his face changed. That's what I remember most. The small, precise movement of his eyes tracking the loop of his signature, then the way his mouth rounded, as if the shape could help explain the shape of what he saw. For a second, he blinked, like someone realizing they'd forgotten to lock a door. Michelle stood up from her chair with the same calm professionalism she'd carried into every meeting. She introduced herself in the formal way agents do when they mean the words to be remembered. "Special Agent Michelle Torres, FBI Financial Crimes Division," she said. The syllables landed like a ledger entry. Plain, official, immovable. There was a man at the table I'd not expected Derek to see there. Richard Brennan, taller than his headshot suggested, suit precise, hands a little too practiced, sat with a polite gravity and a folder in front of him. He had come because Meridian wanted a chance to clarify before anything went public. He said something that was meant to be disarming, the CEO version of small talk. "I appreciate you making time." His smile was the work of someone who had rehearsed being reasonable. Derek's eyes moved from the signature on the manifest to my face. I said nothing. I had never thought that quiet could be so loud, but in that moment it was. Silence pulled everything tight. Michelle explained in measured tones what the manifestation of those documents meant. She pointed to a manifest that bore Derek's signature and to GPS logs that showed a truck idle on the day it was supposed to have been in motion. She didn't accuse him. She explained the implication. This document is part of a network of records showing shipments that never occurred. Names on the paperwork show a pattern we've traced back to accounts receiving funds tied to Meridian. Her voice was flat but not cruel. She was describing fact. Derek swallowed. "I signed a lot of papers," he finally said. "You can't, there are mistakes." "It's not about a single signature," Michelle said. "It's about the pattern. We'll need your cooperation to understand whether the signatures were produced knowingly, or whether templates were used, or whether someone else. At this stage, I need to tell you that being implicated means you could be a witness, a target, or both. We'll be in touch." Richard Brennan's hands moved then. The CEO tried something closer to contrition. "Emily, this is regrettable. If there's been any wrongdoing, we want to know the truth. I'm prepared to assist. This company has policies." His words slid across the table and stopped against the stack of documents. I pushed one file toward him.
It had a memo that began innocuously: reclassify pensions into long-term hold-uns visible.
He rifled through the pages as if searching for a sentence that might change their meaning. He did not find one. "You've taken money from 2,300 employees' pensions," I said quietly. The number felt like an anchor. I had not wanted that detail to be a slam, but it needed to be said. It needed to set the scale of harm against the intimacy of our kitchen. Richard looked up as if my voice had turned a light on. "Miss Emily, we will cooperate," he said. The appeal was for the benefit of a camera I knew wasn't there. It was the sort of line designed for shareholders and press statements. His eyes found mine for a heartbeat and then slid away. Derek's face crumpled in the slow way of people who are trying to assemble a narrative fast enough to stand up in court. "Emily, I can explain. Maybe someone used my badge, my papers," he said. It was true that access badges in Bourne circulate. It was also true that signatures appear in dozens of contexts. The question was whether his name was a deliberate instrument in a scheme or an incidental mark. Janet, who had lingered in the doorway in that odd combination of curiosity and comfort-seeking, suddenly looked like someone who'd misread the invitation to a party. She blinked and tried to find a place to stand that did not feel exposed. Her knitting needles, still clicking in her hand, made the only domestic sound. The CEO put his hand over his folder and spoke again. "We're committed to transparency. We will provide all the records you request. I will be the first to say there have been errors." Michelle cut him off with a technicality. "We've already secured some records, Mr. Brennan. We have bank transfers tied to Shell accounts, and we have internal memos that indicate funds were diverted away from pension liabilities. That's why we're here." She looked at him like someone naming a fact. He leaned forward, and for the first time I saw fear that was not the varnish of a PR person. It was quick, flickering, and honest, in the way fear is when it meets a force it cannot charm. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "We want documents and testimony," Michelle said. "We want to understand who approved which transfers and why. We want to know who benefited." Derek's hands trembled as he pointed at the manifest where his signature looped. "That is my signature," he said, "but I wasn't on that route." It was a statement, both defense and surprise. Michelle took a breath and said, "We may be asking you to come in, Mr. Henderson. For now, you should stay available." I had rehearsed the sound of Derek being told he needed to cooperate. I had not rehearsed the tone of his voice when it broke. There was an odd domestic shame in it that made the room smell of coffee and old shirts and the small battered mug his brother had given him. He looked at me, and for the first time all afternoon I saw him trying to read a version of me he had not considered. Not simply a woman who liked spreadsheets, but someone whose work could make people accountable. Richard cleared his throat, and his voice shifted into CEO mode again. "This is damaging," he said, the word carefully neutral. "To my company, to our reputation." "It's damaging to people," I said. I kept the anger out of my voice on purpose. Anger would have been a motive the defense could use to claim vindictiveness. "It's damaging to Carol Simmons and to Harold Evans. Their lives are changing because of spreadsheets you moved." Michelle pulled out a list and read names aloud, the cadence of it making a roll call. Carol Simmons, Harold Evans, Liza Park, Timothy Delgado. The names were not abstractions, not footnotes in an annual report. They were the stakes. Richard's face went a shade paler when he heard Carol's name, maybe because I had told Michelle her story in a way that had lodged in the agent's mind, a woman with rent to pay and a pension empty where a promise should have been. He tried to bargain. "We should talk about remediation, about getting funds back," he said. "We can make things right." "You can," Michelle replied, "if the funds are traceable and recoverable. First, you give us the records. Second, you don't interfere." Her gaze was constant. "Third, we will proceed in a way that preserves the integrity of the evidence." There was a long silence. Derek's features folded into an expression that held regret and confusion in equal measure. He looked, for the first time since we'd met, like someone who'd been outside the story and now found himself a character in it. When they left, I felt the house ping with the absence of their shoes. The backyard looked the same as it always had, the old oak tree throwing its familiar bone-shaped shadow. The hum of the refrigerator resumed in a way that marked a return to ordinary sound. But the ordinary had been reorganized. The invisible ledger of our lives had permuted. 2 days later, the local paper ran a small piece, one paragraph on the corporate beat about an ongoing federal inquiry into Meridian Financial, and a discreet mention of Henderson Logistics cooperating with authorities.
Within a week, social media had picked up threads. News vans that had never slowed by our cul-de-sac began to appear at the corner. The neighbors, curious, came to the edge of my lawn and pretended they were out for a walk while their phones recorded the scene. The machine that turns private failures into public spectacle stuttered into motion. Derek was suspended from Henderson. There was no dramatic firing. Suspension is the corporate way of putting someone in a box until you know whether to keep, fire, or hand them to prosecutors. He came to me the first night after his suspension with the sort of half-formed remorse that looks for absolution and finds only facts.
"I didn't know," he kept saying. "I would have." "You didn't know," I said, "or you ignored it." I said it gently. I had no interest in theatrics. I wanted him to see responsibility as something that could be claimed or refused. He tried to cooperate with the investigators. There were interviews, then subpoenas, then the larger, colder process of grand jury preparation. I attended witness prep sessions with agents who coached me on staying precise and not letting emotion become the headline. Counselors would sometimes teach witnesses how to speak in short declarative sentences. The legal world rewards composure and penalizes theatricality. For weeks, I practiced saying, "I saved copies of these files," in ways that made the language neutral. The grand jury process itself was a closed one. Prosecutors assembled a mosaic of evidence. The memos labeled in euphemism, the wire transfers, the shell companies registered in names that did not correspond to real offices, the manifests that claimed shipments that had no GPS trace. They called witnesses who could corroborate the procedural oddities, an accounts payable clerk who remembered being told to reclassify a line, a middle manager who'd been shuffled out of a meeting. When I took the stand in front of the grand jurors, I felt the peculiar responsibility of being a translator. I needed to make obscure accounting moves readable to 12 people who would decide whether probable cause existed. The defense strategy, when it came to light later, was predictable. They tried to paint me as vengeful. They tried to suggest I had an axe to grind because I'd staged my layoff and had the motive to frame others. They asked whether I had ever discussed my grievances with coworkers, whether I had a history of conflict with management. They suggested that the evidence might have been altered. They asked about my relationship with Derek in a way that invited jurors to see the case as domestic drama rather than corporate crime. What the prosecution had, and what ultimately mattered, was the paper trail. Chain of custody memories, who had access to what files and when, mattered in the same way as signature matters at closing. The drives I had scattered, the attorney who had kept a copy, the timestamps of emails, metadata showing edits and forwards. These things created a lattice prosecutors could walk across to demonstrate intent and opportunity. The memos that read like beige corporate speak became obvious when set against bank transfers and shell accounts receiving funds timed to pension contributions. The grand jury returned indictments for multiple Meridian executives. The list of charges was not poetry. It was a set of legal labels that bad actors learned to dread. Several executives were indicted and later convicted. They were sentenced to prison. The exact terms belonged to the courts and to the record. Some received multi-year sentences. I do not speak of their punishment with triumph. Punishment was a legal consequence, not personal satisfaction. It was a system doing its work, and in that doing, the possibility of restitution opened up. The fallout for Henderson Logistics was significant. Derek was named in civil suits and was suspended from his job. He was later indicted as some charges emerged that suggested his signature had been used in documents central to the scheme. Whether he had knowingly participated or had been manipulated became a question for lawyers. There were depositions where his cheeks went pink and where he looked older than he had the right to feel. When the media wanted a human angle, they asked about motive, about family, about how a man could be swept up in fraud. Our private life became the texture reporters wanted to paint a picture. Carol Simmons got a letter in the mail one March afternoon that said her account had been corrected and a payment scheduled. She called me and said, "I really didn't think I'd ever see this number again." Her voice was small and a little hoarse. We met at a diner and she cried into her coffee, not in fury but in a soft gratitude, the sort that has the shape of relief. She later sent me a typed note, the edges a little worn, thanking me for holding the paper until someone with power could make the paperwork do what it had promised. That letter lived in my desk for a long time. Restitution was not total. The legal machinery retrieved a substantial portion of the funds, but not all. Litigation recovers what it can, and sometimes the cost of recovery eats into what remains. Still, pensions that had once shown blank lines started to show numbers again.
People who had been frightened went back to planning small things: a new roof, a dental procedure, a granddaughter's college fund. These were not grand victories. They were the slow stitch of repair. The personal cost, though, was unavoidable. Derek and I separated. The marriage that had been a landscape of small daily conversations could not survive the expansion of secrets and the shrinkage of trust. There is no dramatic cliff to that process, no courtroom scene where someone hands you a script. It was paperwork, quiet negotiations over a house, the division of a life into boxes and labeled drawers. I sold the house we'd shared. The last time I walked through it, I paused in the kitchen where Derek had laughed and ran my hand along the countertop as if it were a relic. I packed the dish towels I had folded so often, the mug his brother had given him, the photo of us at a beach where we'd pretended to have it all figured out. Moving felt like an inventory of a person's life and an opportunity to choose again what to keep. Professionally, I rebuilt. I didn't want to return to corporate accounting in the same way. The world had shown me how vulnerable institutions are to bad incentives and clever language.
I went back to school for a certificate in forensic accounting and began doing the work that I'd once done at Meridian, but on the other side, helping organizations expose what had been hidden. The small domestic acts, making a meal for myself, folding a towel, arranging a shelf, kept me steady. The work satisfied a different part of me. It was methodical and deeply human, and it meant helping people like Carol. There were thin seasons, evenings when gratitude and loss braided themselves in ways I had no vocabulary for. I accepted that my life had exacted a price. Divorce, scrutiny, the weight of memory, these are not trivial. But there were also letters, like Carol's, that were small, luminous proof that my work mattered beyond the moment of personal vindication. People wrote to say that because of what I'd done, they could sleep a little easier at night. District's pension managers reached out to say they were using the memos we'd uncovered to tighten controls. Young accountants sent emails asking how I'd kept my ethics intact. Those notes pooled into a kind of warmth I hadn't expected. The press after the indictments was an unsteady thing. Some pieces were fair, some veered into the prurient. I learned how to make a short statement and then hand the microphone to someone else. I learned that my face in the paper could distract from the names that mattered if I let it, so I said little publicly and let the prosecutors and the courts do their part. When the trials concluded, several executives went to prison. The sentences were recorded and reported. They were not a victory lap for me. They were objectively a result of institutions doing their work to hold leaders accountable. There were practicalities that followed: settlement talks, restorative funds, the bureaucracy of tracing money across accounts and time zones. Legal processes can be slow and messily bureaucratic, but the momentum we had created did not die with the indictments. Victims recovered a substantial portion of what was owed, and in small, meaningful ways, lives were repaired. My relationship with my mother-in-law shifted too. Janet called a few times at first, awkwardly, then less often. She came to say she was sorry for the way she'd minimized me, not in dramatic scenes, but in a small, vulnerable way, an old person admitting she'd been wrong. I accepted the gesture without making it into redemption for her. Some repairs are small and partial. She later sent a postcard with a recipe written in her tidy hand. It felt human, complicated, real. Years later, sometimes in a quiet afternoon, I'd sit at my new kitchen table and fold a towel. The motion steadied me. I'd think of the cardboard box in which I once packed my life, and how that prop had become a hinge for a larger truth. I thought of Carol balancing her checkbook again, of Harold fixing his porch, of my own life becoming a different kind of work that fed me.
I thought of Derek, who had been both a private domestic presence and a public variable in a case that reshaped professional lives. There was no single moral to hand anybody, not a tidy lesson about marriage or about corporate fraud. But there was a clear fact. People who behave as if obligations are optional will eventually be asked to account. I do not tell this story to gloat. I tell it because the laugh that landed in my kitchen is a tiny human thing that can be a real measure of how we view people who do steady work behind the scenes. The laugh was a moment of underestimation. The meeting with the CEO and the agents was the moment when underestimation met consequences. Justice, measured, flawed, human, did its work. The people who needed help got it. Sometimes a letter arrives at my desk that starts, "Dear Emily," and ends with a thank you. Those letters are the thing I carry into the day when the headlines have moved on. They are evidence, in their own quiet way, that the seam between domestic life and public consequence exists, and that an ordinary person can, with patience and precision, make a difference. If this story stayed with you, Tell me which moment struck you the most in the comments, and subscribe if you want more stories like this.